Okay, so apparently a bunch of you guys got together, I guess on Friday or something, because I got about 5 emails in the span of 20 minutes that all said almost the exact same thing, which is that you guys wanted to postpone the exam. And it's a nice try, but unfortunately I can't do that for 2 reasons, as I laid out in my email to you guys. First off, I can't be sure that's not going to negatively impact some students. It's possibly some students won't be available on Wednesday and we're planning on taking the exam on Monday. And I can't inconvenience them with only 2 days notice. It's just not enough notice ahead of time. And secondly, I just don't have an extra class in the semester to postpone the exam to Wednesday. I won't be able to cover all the material. So I can't postpone the exam, unfortunately. However, I did feel kind of bad for you guys that exam 2 is the day after spring break, which kind of sucks. So for that reason, I figured I would give you guys a review session today where I can cover any class material you want me to cover. And at the very end of the session, I'll give a couple hints as to the short answer questions on the exam, or at least the topics. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just get people's questions, and you can either type them into chat, or if you would rather, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. Whatever you'd like to do. Any questions by anybody? Remember, there's a whole study guide that has questions in it. I'll give you guys a second if you're typing out a question. It's not a problem. The actor-observer effect and examples. Yes, I can do that. And hold on, I'm going to be explaining it as I'm logging in with my other laptop. So hold on one second. So the actor-observer effect is an attributional bias, whereby we have a tendency to explain other people's behavior in terms of their disposition and their personality, right? We make internal attributions for other people, but we tend to make external attributions for our own behavior. So the actor-observer effect is that difference. It's the fact that we make external attributions for our behavior and internal attributions for other people's behavior. And so examples would be things like, if you failed the exam, that's because you're not intelligent. But if I failed the exam, that's because I was too stressed out and I couldn't concentrate because of other things, right? So I'm explaining the same behavior in terms of an internal cause for you, right? You did pass because you're not intelligent, but I'm making an external attribution for myself. I was distracted or I couldn't concentrate, and that's why I failed. So it's that discrepancy between how we make attributions for ourselves versus for other people. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to try to take these in order. So adjustment is often insufficient. So that has to do with the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. So if you recall, what that heuristic says is that when we are trying to estimate some numerical value of something that we don't know what the answer is, then what we do is we find an anchor. We find a known numerical value, and then we adjust from that anchor. So an example I used in class was if you had to estimate at what temperature vodka freezes. Okay, that's a numerical estimate you have to come up with, and you probably don't know what the actual answer is. So what you do is you say, well, I know what temperature water freezes at. Water freezes at 32. And I know vodka has to freeze at some temperature lower than that because the vodka in my freezer is not frozen. And so you adjust downwards from that anchor of 32. When I say that adjustment is often insufficient, what that means is that we tend not to adjust enough from our anchor. So usually if you have people estimate what temperature vodka freezes at, they might say something like 0 or -10 or something like that. The answer is between -16 and -40, depending on the purity. So all that means is that adjustment from that initial anchor tends not to go far enough. People don't adjust enough to the correct answer. Okay, can you go over the difference between cognitive dissonance and self-perception? Yeah, so this is going to be an important one. You will definitely need to know this for the exam. This will be a short answer question, as a matter of fact. So the difference is that according to cognitive dissonance theory, we want all of our beliefs and our attitudes and our thoughts and our behaviors to all be consistent with one another, right? But sometimes they're not. Sometimes we'll say one thing and we'll do another. So under those situations, we feel this negative aversive arousal. We feel uncomfortable. We feel maybe like hypocrites kind of thing. And as a consequence, we want to get rid of that negative arousal experience. And we can do that by justifying our past behavior. So basically what we do is that if we behaved in a way that conflicted with our attitudes, we'll try to reason out a way to convince ourselves that in fact there really wasn't a conflict, or the conflict wasn't really important, or something along those lines, right? So we justify our past behavior, or we rationalize our past behavior to get rid of that negative arousal, okay? That's cognitive dissonance theory. Self-perception theory, which is used to explain the same phenomena, it's the same studies, but a self-perception theorist says that we don't justify our past behaviors. Like whenever I say justify or rationalize, those are terms you only experience or you only see in cognitive dissonance theory, okay? That it kind of means like we're kind of lying to ourselves a little bit to rationalize our behavior. But a self-perception theorist doesn't agree with that. A self-perception theorist says that we don't rationalize or justify our past behaviors. Okay. All we're doing is that when we're trying to figure out what our attitude is, we think about our past behavior and we come to a rational inference or a rational conclusion about what our attitude must be based on that past behavior. Okay. So for instance, and I might as well tell you now, one of the short answer questions on the exam will have you explain some phenomenon in terms of both cognitive dissonance theory and self-perception theory. When you do that, when you explain it in terms of cognitive dissonance theory, you should use terms like rationalize or justify or something along those lines. You want to say that's and we do that to get rid of that negative arousal, that cognitive dissonance. When you explain the same phenomenon using a self-perception explanation, you should not use those terms. If you use rationalize or justify, or if you talk about any sort of negative arousal, anything like that, that you will lose points. Okay, you don't want to say that. Self-perception theorists just say that we think about our past behavior and come to a rational conclusion. So you want to use terms like rational inference or rational conclusion about what people's attitudes must be. And I can go into that a little bit more if you want, but I just want to make sure I get through the other questions that are here as well. Can you go over the Kelly attribution theory again? Yeah. Hang on a second. Sorry, guys, my computer's being really weird over here. Okay. So Kelly's attribution theory is an attribution theory that came around in the 70s. And at the time in the 70s, people thought, or I should say social psychologists thought that people behaved relatively rationally. So this was before we learned all about the biases and heuristics that we talked about before in the class. At the time, people thought that, or social psychologists thought that people behaved fairly rationally. And Kelly's attribution theory reflects that idea. So according to this attribution theory, Kelly says that when we're trying to explain someone else's behavior, we can do so globally in terms of either internal or external causes, right? And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we tend to explain other people's behavior in terms of their internal causes. But nonetheless, we can do both. We can sometimes make internal, sometimes make external attributions. And so Kelly wanted to know what determines whether someone makes an internal or an external attribution for someone else's behavior. And according to his theory, what we do is we use three types of information to come to that conclusion. We use consensus information. So if we're trying to explain someone else's behavior, so let's say that someone behaved rudely to someone else, okay? So why are they behaving rudely? Is it because they're a rude person? That's an internal attribution. Or is it because there was something else going on in their life, they were distracted or whatever, and that's an external attribution. So what determines whether we make those two attributions? Well, we ask ourselves a consensus question, which is, do other people behave the same way in similar situations? So if you're seeing someone behave rude to, let's say, a waiter at a restaurant, the question is, do other people also behave rudely to waiters at restaurants? Or is it just this one person that behaves rudely? That's the consensus question, okay? And you're gonna answer either yes or no to that. If you answer yes, that there is consensus, then the behavior is high in consensus. If you answer no, then the behavior is low in consensus. The second question that you ask yourself is a distinctiveness question, which basically says, does this person behave the same way in other similar situations? So are they always rude to waiters every time they go out to eat? Or are they normally nice to them and this is just one time that they were rude to a waiter? Okay. If you answer yes, that they behave the same way in other situations, the behavior is low in distinctiveness. If you answer no, the behavior is high in distinctiveness. And then you ask yourself the consistency question. Does this person always behave the same way in the same situation? So every time we go to this restaurant and we have this waiter, does this person always behave rudely to this waiter? Or are they sometimes rude, sometimes nice to this person? And so once you do that, and if you answer yes to that question, the behavior is high in consistency. If you answer no, the behavior is low in consistency. And then once you put all those three pieces of information together, you end up with a pattern. So you could end up by concluding that that person's behavior is high in consensus and high in distinctiveness and high in consistency, or low in consensus, low in distinctiveness, high in consistency, or whatever. And depending on the pattern that you come up with, that will lead you to a certain attribution. So basically, Kelly's attribution theory is just saying that for us to come to an internal or an external attribution, we use three pieces of information in order to come up to that attribution. Okay, I need help with the four components of cognitive dissonance. And so when I see your hands up, I'll get to you in 1 second after I take this question. Okay, so I gotta make sure that I can remember what the four components are. So obviously one of the main components, maybe the most important one for our purposes, is that there has to be arousal, because that's by definition what cognitive dissonance is. If there is no physiological arousal, there's no uncomfortable feeling, then by definition, it can't be cognitive dissonance. Okay, so that is the most important criteria for that. A second criteria is that the behavior has to produce negative consequences. So in other words, we can handle a lot of situations where we are a little bit hypocritical, where our behavior conflicts with our attitudes a little bit. If there's no negative consequence, then it doesn't really matter. We don't feel bad about it. So, but if we behave in a way that conflicts with our attitudes, that has some negative outcome, then that's going to tend to produce cognitive dissonance. But the basic idea is if there's no negative outcome, then there won't be cognitive dissonance. A third component of dissonance is that you have to feel personally responsible for your behavior. What that means is that if you were forced into a behavior that conflicts with your attitudes, you're not going to feel bad about it because you didn't choose to engage in that behavior, right? You're not a hypocrite if you were forced into it. So you have to feel like you freely chose to engage in the behavior that conflicts with your attitudes. If you don't feel like you freely chose it, then you won't experience cognitive dissonance. And the fourth component is that when you have that physiological arousal, that negative, uncomfortable feeling, you have to attribute it to your own behavior. So in other words, let's say that you engage in a behavior that conflicts with your attitude, right? So you're a bit of a hypocrite. And so you get that negative feeling. But if you think that you're having that negative feeling because of something else, because you took a medication earlier and you think it's a side effect of the medication, then you don't realize that you're feeling bad about your behavior. And as a consequence, you're not going to feel the need to justify your behavior because you don't realize that's what's causing that negative feeling. So you have to realize that that negative feeling you get, that cognitive dissonance you're experiencing, is due to your behavior. And if you realize that, then you will try to reduce it. And if you don't realize that, you won't try to reduce dissonance. Simone, I'm going to call on you. So you can unmute yourself now.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. The Kelly attribution, I was trying to ask, is it a way for it, like, that's why I didn't want to type it because I didn't know how to say it. Like,
yeah.
In the chapter, it shows high, high, low for it to be like the external and internal. Like, it had to be both consensus and consistent and distinctive for it to be external. You know, if that makes, like, can it
be high in each, right? You're saying?
Yeah, like how can it be where it's like, what if it's one consensus and both of them are distinctive? I mean, one is distinctive. You know what I mean? Like, how can it, I don't know how to explain it, where, how do you know if it's external or internal if it's not specifically consensus, consistency and distinctive?
Like, I mean, so I think maybe we were asking me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Kelly's attribution theory says that to make an external attribution, the behavior has to be high in each one of those three things, right?
Right.
And to make an internal, it has to be low in the first two and high in the last one, right?
Right.
Low in consensus and distinctiveness, high in consistency. So are you asking me what happens if it's some other pattern?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, so if it's another, so you could have a behavior that is like high in consensus and low in distinctiveness and low in consistency, which isn't covered here, right? So basically, for any other pattern of attributions other than the two I have listed, it's ambiguous. It's unclear what the attribution is.
Okay.
So that's all it is.
Okay. All right. Perfect. And then the chapter that you were going over before with the cognitive, which chapter is that from? Like, how do you, the cognitive these words are so annoying.
What chapter in the textbook you're asking?
No, in the when did we go over it? Like, was it chapter 8?
There was the last 2 lectures before
Yeah,
spring
the
break,
last 2 lectures were
basically.
those are the ones that confused me the most, was the last 2 lectures we had, because the words were so
Right,
similar.
right. And I'm sure I'll be talking a little bit more about cognitive dissonance over the next
Okay, all right,
40
we'll
minutes.
go there.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so someone asked, how does self-perception theory explain the results of dissonance? So that's kind of what I was mentioning before. So again, cognitive dissonance is all about rationalizing and justifying behaviors. Self-perception theory is all about coming to a rational conclusion about what your attitude must be now based on your past behavior. And so we could look at almost any cognitive dissonance study, and we can explain it in terms of self-perception theory. So here's an example. So let's take the original cognitive dissonance study. So remember, this is the one where people engaged in a really boring task. They then lied and told someone else how much fun the study was. And then later on, they were asked about what their attitudes were, right? And the basic idea is that if people lied and they only lied for $1, then they had to justify why they lied. And they justified it by convincing themselves, by rationalizing their behavior, by convincing themselves that in fact, they really did like the study. They kind of like lied to themselves, tell them that, right? Then that way they didn't really feel like they were lying. So that they justified their behavior, right? But a self-perception theorist would say that's not what happened at all. What happened is that when you ask participants at the very end of the study, how much did you like that study? Then people think, well, I just told someone else how much fun that study was 5 minutes ago, and I was only paid $1 to do it. So I didn't do it for the money. So I guess if I told them the study was fun, I must have thought the study was fun. So I guess I thought the study was really fun. Okay, so you can see in that explanation, they're not justifying or rationalizing anything. They're coming to what they think is a completely logical conclusion. Okay, so that's the difference between self-perception theory and cognitive dissonance theory. Okay, I see another Kelly's attribution theory question. I've already covered that. What are real life examples of the 3 different types of cognitive dissonance? So I think you mean the 3 different domains in which we see cognitive dissonance, I believe. These are not different types of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is all kind of the same thing, but they're different implications of the theory, right? So the first one we talked about, the example I just used, is when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with our attitudes. Then we have to justify that behavior. So we call that justifying attitude discrepant behavior, when your behavior is discrepant with your attitudes. That's when we have to justify our feeling of being a hypocrite by convincing ourselves we weren't really hypocrites. A second one is when we have to justify the effort that we put into a task. So if you go through a lot of effort, and effort could mean physical effort, could mean time, it could mean money, spend a lot of money to do something, we feel a need to justify it, right? If you were to buy a house, for instance, and then once you bought the house, and you spent a lot of money, you spent a lot of time looking into it, then once you bought it, it turns out you don't really like it at all. Well, that would mean that you would have to admit that you're a bad decision maker. You made a really bad mistake and you've got to live with this mistake for years. We don't like that psychologically. So we convince ourselves, of course, this is the best house we could have bought. And we'll justify that having gone through that effort, right? The other example I use for that is people who are joining like a fraternity or something that are getting hazed, getting initiated. And people feel the need to justify willingly going through that initiation, which they'll do by convincing themselves they really wanted to be a part of that group. And the third domain in which you see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects is when people have to justify difficult decisions. So when you're trying to decide between 2 things, between buying this car or that car, we can struggle with making that decision ahead of time. But as soon as we make that decision, for similar reasons as I just explained, we feel a need to justify having decided this thing over this thing. We don't want to feel like we made a bad choice, right? So all we do is we think about only the positive things of the thing we chose, of the car we chose, say, and only the negative things of the car we didn't choose. And that way we justify in our head having made that purchase. And so the thing that we bought, as soon as you buy something or as soon as you choose one thing over another, that thing becomes much more attractive as a way to avoid feeling cognitive dissonance. Okay, and sorry, I'm a little bit behind, guys. I'll try to catch up. Difference between anchoring and adjustment heuristics is that they're not precise. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Difference, anchoring and adjustment is one heuristic, so I'm not sure what you're saying. Difference between that and what? So I'll come back to that. Under what circumstances are self-perception and dissonance theories applicable? Okay, so the main idea here is that cognitive dissonance kicks in when the discrepancy between your behavior and your attitude is large. Okay, so if you have a certain attitude and you do the exact opposite of that attitude, that's when we feel like hypocrites. That's going to make us feel bad. That's going to create that negative arousal. That's when cognitive dissonance is going to kick in and we're going to feel a need to justify our behaviors. When the discrepancy is small, so we engage in a behavior that's a little bit different than our attitude. It's not the complete opposite, it's a little bit different. When that difference is small, that's when self-perception theory is applicable. That's when we infer what our attitude must be by thinking about our past behavior. Okay, so I just went over this one. From a cognitive dissonance perspective, why do we come to like what we suffer for? So basically, as I mentioned a minute ago, because we have to justify the fact that we willingly chose to go through that suffering. And if we suffer for something and we don't like the thing that we suffered for, well, then why did we suffer for it? Like, we just made a really bad decision by deciding to willingly undergo that suffering, right? So we feel a need to have to justify that suffering. So we convince ourselves we really like what we suffered for. Okay, so 3 types of dissonance. I've already talked about that. Okay, fundamental attribution error. So the fundamental attribution error is the tendency that we all have to over-attribute people's behavior to their disposition, to their attitudes. Okay, so we almost always will say that other people do things because of their personality, and we tend to ignore how the situation might have affected their behavior. That's what the fundamental attribution is. The fact that we ignore how the situation might have affected people's behavior, and we instead explain it in terms of their personality. What are the cultural differences in the fundamental attribution theory? Okay, so the basic idea is that although the name, it says fundamental attribution theory, it's not actually fundamental. We see it much more in Western cultures like this one. And so what happens is that over time, as we grow up in a more Western culture, we learn culturally, we're taught via our culture that people do things because of their personality, because of who they are. And because we're taught that, we learn to make more and more dispositional attributions over time. But in Eastern cultures, they're not taught that. They're not taught that people's behavior is just a function of who they are. They're taught that, they're basically taught to focus on connectedness between things, and that the situation and context can affect behavior. As a consequence, people from Eastern cultures don't engage in the fundamental attribution error as much because they've learned to explain people's behavior in terms of the situation. What are the studies we should all keep in mind for the exam? Okay, so I don't know if there are specific studies. I don't think there's specific studies you need to know, but you do need to know the concepts. The most important concepts are going to be obviously cognitive dissonance theory, self-perception theory, Kelly's attribution theory. Obviously, you're going to want to know the other attributional biases, so the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer effect, the overjustification effect. And then obviously, you're going to need to know all the heuristics and biases that we talked about. Those are kind of the main ideas. Autokinetic effect. Yeah, so we haven't talked about that yet. So I didn't think that was in the study guide, but if it was, it's an accident. We're going to talk about that when we talk about conformity later on. How does the idea of sufficient versus insufficient justification relate to the theory of cognitive dissonance? Okay, so we only experience cognitive dissonance when we have insufficient justification for our behavior. So here's what that means. I have a certain attitude. So I think cheating is wrong, okay? And I cheat on a test. My behavior is in conflict with my attitude, right? And if I have insufficient justification, then that means I don't have a good enough reason why I cheated. So let's just say that I cheated on one test because I had to get a C in the class. Otherwise, I'd be failing out of med school. So in my mind, I might feel justified in having cheated because I had to. That's in my mind. I might think that, right? If that's the case, then I have sufficient justification and I don't feel a need to justify the fact that I cheated. If, on the other hand, I cheated and I can't really justify it any other way, well, now I got to face up to the fact that I'm kind of a hypocrite. I'm against cheating, but I just cheated. So I've got to justify that somehow. So I reduce my cognitive dissonance by justifying my behavior. So the basic idea is that we experience cognitive dissonance when we do not have sufficient justification. In other words, when we have insufficient justification, then we have to use cognitive dissonance. If we have sufficient justification, we do not experience cognitive dissonance. And this relates to the original study. If you recall, the people who were paid, if you remember, $1 to tell a lie to someone else, they experienced cognitive dissonance. And that's because they had insufficient justification for their behavior. I mean, they thought they're honest people, they just lied to someone. And they can't say they did it for the money because they were only paid $1, right? So they had insufficient reason or insufficient justification for why they engaged in that behavior. Cognitive dissonance therefore kicked in, and they justified their behavior by convincing themselves they really liked the study. But the people who were paid $20 to lie and tell someone else how much fun the study was, they have sufficient justification. They know why they lied. They lied for $20. Yeah, they're a hypocrite, but they're willing to be a hypocrite for $20. Because they had sufficient justification, they didn't feel that need to justify their behavior, so they didn't experience cognitive dissonance. And that's why the $20 people, the people who were paid $20 to lie to someone else, they didn't come to convince themselves that they really liked the study because they didn't feel a need to justify their behavior, because the $20 was enough to justify it. Do we need to know the examples? I don't know what you mean. The examples of what? Can we just go over the whole last page of the study guide? I mean, I could do that too. Yeah. Let me get to everyone's questions, then we can do whatever you want there. If adjustment is often insufficient, is that just saying that it's not precise enough for a final conclusion? I think I have that associated with the bug. Okay, so it's not that we don't realize it's insufficient. Okay, so what's happening here is that when people have to come up with a numeric estimate, they're engaging in anchoring and adjustment. They don't realize it necessarily, but that's what they're doing. But the problem is that when people adjust from that initial anchor, they tend not to adjust far enough. But the people themselves don't realize they're not adjusting far enough, right? They think they're coming up with the right answer. So if I ask them at what temperature vodka freezes, and they say, well, water freezes at 32, it's got to be lower than that. I think about -10 sounds about right. They don't know that their adjustment's insufficient, right? It just tends to be. When social psychologists study this, they find that people usually don't adjust enough. So it's just descriptive. So it's precise enough for that person to give a final estimate. It's just that it doesn't go far enough. How does punishment relate to cognitive dissonance? Okay, so this is a study we talked about where kids were told not to play with a toy while the researcher was out of a room. And they were given either a really strong, severe warning or a really mild warning. Now, none of the kids played with the toy while the researcher was gone. When the researcher came back, they asked the kids, how much do you want to play with that toy? And what happened is that the kids who in the severe threat condition, they were told if they play with that toy, they're going to get in such big trouble. They're going to be really harshly punished, right? So those kids wanted to play with the toy. They didn't play with the toy, so their behavior is discrepant, but they know exactly why they didn't play with the toy. It's because of the threat. In other words, they had sufficient justification for their behavior, right? They had a justification. So they didn't feel a need to justify why they didn't play with the toy. So they correctly stated they really still wanted to play with the toy. Okay. But what happened is that the kids in the mild threat condition, they wanted to play with the toy. They didn't play with the toy, but they didn't have sufficient justification for it. They weren't given a severe threat. Okay. So they had insufficient justification for why they didn't play with the toy. If you remember, when you have insufficient justification for why you engaged in a behavior, that's when cognitive dissonance theory kicks in, right? So these kids started to justify, why didn't I play with that toy? You know what? I didn't want to play with it anyway. I don't want to play with that toy. That's why I didn't play with it. And that's how they justified their behavior. Okay. So that's how punishment factors in, is that threats of strong punishment don't invoke cognitive dissonance, whereas threats of mild punishment can, and people will then can internalize why they didn't do the thing that was prohibited. What is an example, or what is an illusory correlation? Could you give an example? So an illusory correlation is any time that someone thinks two things are related that are not. Okay. I mean, the belief that there was that that vaccines caused autism, for instance. is a belief. Now, that's not true. Vaccines don't cause autism. There's no link between those two things, but there's a belief that some people have that those two things are linked. So if you get vaccinated, you're more likely to get autism. That's an example of an illusory correlation. But there's millions of examples of illusory correlations that you could use. But it's just anytime you think two things are linked when in fact they're not. Do we need to know examples of dissonance and examples of anchoring and adjustment? You don't need to know the specific examples I used in class, but you do need to be able to recognize examples of cognitive dissonance or examples of anchoring and adjustment if I gave you a hypothetical scenario. So if I said on an exam, imagine this person is trying to estimate, how deep the ocean is. And they start with this number and then they think it's higher than that. And so therefore they come to their final conclusion. That would be an example of anchoring and adjustment. So you need to be able to recognize when you see them, what the examples are, but you don't need to know the exact examples I gave in class. Yeah, I wish your examples were based on the scenarios you use, would be easier to understand. Yeah, I agree. However, I also want students to be able to generalize past the examples I give in class. And this is kind of one of my main philosophies in teaching, is that I want you to be able to recognize these phenomena in novel situations, right? Because these things happen all the time. And that's why I always want you thinking in terms of these theories, in terms of the conceptually, right? So that you can notice these things in the real world. Like lab tests, we had to relate the term to one of the examples you gave us in class. Are you talking about the examples of dissonance? I can't remember what question you're talking about on the last test. The term to one examples. Oh, like the study? Are you talking about the study on introspection, possibly? Because for that exam, you did need to know one of those 5 studies. I don't have a question like that. I'm not going to ask you to report on a study in this exam. Okay. What is self-presentation and self-monitoring? Okay, good. So the last few slides from the section on the self, you need to know for exam 2, and that basically covers self-presentation and self-monitoring. So self-presentation refers to the strategies that we use to shape what other people think about us. So when you go on a job interview, you go into that interview wanting to look professional and act professional and to come across as knowledgeable and reliable, right? And when you're with your friends, you want to come across as being really fun and you're a lot more casual and things like that. So the fact that you're changing your behavior in those situations, you're changing that because of self-presentation. You're presenting yourself differently depending on the situation, okay? That's what self-presentation is. Self-monitoring is an individual difference factor, meaning it's a personality factor that differs from individual to individual, hence individual difference. And so it refers to the extent to which a given person engages in self-presentation. So what that means is that there are some people who are really, really high self-presenters, or meaning like they change who they are a lot, depending on the situation. We call those people high self-monitors. They engage in a lot of self-presentation because they're always thinking about how they should behave. On the other hand, there are certain people who don't really think about the situation or the context that they're in. And because of that, they're not changing their behavior depending on the situation they're in. We call those people low self-monitors. So they're not using self-presentation strategies a lot. Okay, so self-monitoring is a personality variable that differs from person to person that reflects the extent to which people engage in self-presentation strategies. Okay, did I answer every question? Sometimes people are responding to things I said a few minutes ago and I can't remember what they're responding to. So I'm not sure if I've answered all the questions or not, but again, I can answer more. Is there a difference between self-presentation and high self-monitoring? So the difference is that self-monitoring is a personality characteristic, okay? Self-presentation are just in general strategies people use to manipulate what other people think about them. So self-monitoring is the personality characteristic that relates to how much people engage in self-presentation. Okay, so they're very similar. It's just that one's a personality characteristic and one's a behavior. And while I'm waiting, if Simona, if you have other questions, please feel free to ask as many as you want. While we're waiting, I'll mention that the short answer portion of the exam is going to be composed of one question from the heuristics and biases section, one question from the attribution section, and one question from cognitive dissonance self-perception. And I already mentioned the cognitive dissonance self-perception question is, I'm going to give you a scenario and I want you to explain what's happening in terms of both those perspectives. So as I mentioned, you can use words like rationalize and justify to reduce negative arousal for cognitive dissonance. Obviously, you're going to want to do that in the context of the specific question I'm giving you on the exam, right? And then for self-perception, you're going to want to use words like, come to a rational conclusion based on past behavior. So the three questions. So one on cognitive dissonance / self-perception, one on attribution theory. So you're going to want to know, for instance, Kelly's attribution theory is the biggest theory we talked about. So definitely know Kelly's attribution theory, obviously. And then one on heuristics and biases. And one thing I like to do on my exams, which I did on my first exam as well, and I am doing on this one, is I like you to come up with explanations in a hypothetical scenario. So for instance, if you remember from the last exam, I told you, or one of the questions was about, I think it was Michael that loses money playing blackjack. And so you had to give me reasons or ways that he might use 4 different self-enhancement strategies to maintain his self-esteem. So the same principle would hold here when we're talking about something like heuristics and biases, right? So in a given scenario, you should be able to explain why people might believe this false belief and explain it in terms of confirmation bias and belief perseverance and the availability heuristic and things like that. Why does belief perseverance occur? So belief perseverance occurs because, well, first off, let's just go over what it is, right? So let's say I tell you some fact, okay? And so you believe it and you go home tonight and you think about it over and over, and then you come back the next day, and the next day, tomorrow, I say, you know what I told you is completely wrong. I just made that up, okay? Now, logically speaking, you should now abandon that belief, right? Because I just made up the whole purpose, the whole basis of the reason why you had that belief in the first place has been undermined. So you should abandon that belief. What belief perseverance refers to, though, is the tendency that people have to stick to and cling to their beliefs, even when they've been discredited. Why does that happen? Well, because if I tell you some sort of weird fact tonight, you go home and think about it, you start coming up with reasons why that fact is true. Because we talk about things like confirmation biases, right? So once you believe something, we look only for information that supports that belief. So you have now come up with like 5 reasons on your own why that belief is true. So tomorrow when I come back and I say, you know, what I told you yesterday is not true at all, so I undermine your belief, well, you still have those 5 reasons you've come up with yourself for why that belief is true. I haven't undermined those. And so because you still have those 5 beliefs, you still tend to cling to that belief. And that is why one way to get rid of belief perseverance is that when you think, or when you learn some sort of new fact, to think about reasons why it might be true and to think about reasons why it might be false. If we do that, and then we're later forced to abandon our initial belief, well, now we've come up with reasons why it might be true and it might be false. So now we don't really know if it's true or false anymore, which is what we want, right? So we're no longer going to stubbornly cling to our beliefs in that case. Okay, let me come back to that attitude and behavior question in 1 second, Simone, because that's going to require a little bit more unpacking. Let me just take this one first. How does the availability heuristic relate to the base rate fallacy? So, well, I've got 2 answers for this one. Well, okay, I'll give you one answer to this one. So the basic idea is that if you're trying to make a decision, so I think the example I used in class was like you're trying to buy a car, right? You're trying to figure out, do people like this one car that you're really interested in? Well, the availability heuristic says that we estimate the likelihood of something based on how easily we can think of examples of that thing. So if we have a friend who had that same car we're thinking about buying, if they had a really bad experience, well, we can really easily think of people who've had bad experiences with that car. They come to mind easily because it's your friend, right? Because they come to mind easily, we think they happen all the time. Base rates mean the statistical base rate information, meaning, so for instance, if there's a survey of 10,000 people who bought this one car you're interested in, and 90% of them said that they like it, that would be the base rate information. But when you're thinking, when you're debating, okay, I want to buy this car, should I buy this car? What comes to mind more easily? Your one friend who had a bad experience, or the survey results? I mean, survey results, statistical base rate information doesn't come to mind easily at all. What comes to mind is your one friend who had one bad experience. As a consequence, because of the availability heuristic that leads our one friend's experience come to mind more easily than statistical information, we tend to overweight that experience. We tend to ignore the base rate information, the statistical information. We ignore the fact that 9,000 out of 10,000 people love this car, and we don't buy the car because we had one friend who had a bad experience. So that's how the availability heuristic can lead us to the base rate fallacy. The false consensus effect. Well, fortunately, that was on exam 1. I did mention it in terms of the availability heuristic, but that's not going to be on the exam because it's a little bit tricky. So basically, you're not going to have to know the false consensus effect for this exam. That being said, just because you should know what it is anyway, the false consensus effect is when we overestimate how many other people engage in the same negative behaviors we do. So if you cheat on your taxes, you think everyone else cheats on their taxes too. If you drink and drive, you think everyone drinks and drives. Now, that's not true, but we convince ourselves that's true because if everyone else drinks and drives and everyone else cheats on their taxes, then I don't have to feel bad about the fact that I do it as well. How many questions are about conditioning? I assume you're talking about operant conditioning and classical conditioning from the attitude section. Probably, I mean, it wouldn't be more than 2, probably. And I want to go back to Simone's question. Does attitude always predict behavior? If attitude influences behavior, then I saw, of course, okay. Yeah, so the attitude and behavior section is, I think, a section that people are tend to get confused about. Okay. I think students have always struggled with understanding what this means. So when I talk about the attitude behavior relationship, what I mean is, do our attitudes, are they consistent with our behaviors? The example I always use, if you say you like Coke, that's your attitude. Does that mean you're going to drink Coke? Right. And we would assume, well, of course it does. Like, of course your attitudes and your behaviors are related. In fact, in a sense, cognitive dissonance theory is all about how we want to make sure our attitudes and our behaviors are related, right? The problem was that there were many, many studies which seemed to show that there was no relationship between attitudes and behaviors. So I talked about the one study where Lapierre and a Chinese couple went around the United States, and they went to 250 different campgrounds and restaurants and hotels. And they were served in 249 out of 250 of those places, despite the fact that at the time they did the study, there was widespread discrimination against the Chinese. Okay, but nonetheless, over 99% of places served them. When they got back, they sent an attitude questionnaire to all these places, and over 90% of them, I think it was about 90%, said that they would not serve them. So what that means is people's attitudes, which is I won't serve Chinese people, conflicted with their behavior, which is that they did serve Chinese people. And there were a whole bunch of studies like that where people's attitudes didn't correspond to their behaviors, which seemed really weird. And so what researchers did is they started looking at the conditions under which attitudes and behaviors were in fact related. And we know that they are now, but only under the right circumstances. The most important circumstance is that you have to measure the behavior and the attitude at the same level of specificity. So if you want to predict, for instance, if someone's going to go to church on Sunday, there's a whole bunch of questions you can ask them, right? Are you religious? Do you normally go to church? What's your attitude towards going to church? What's your attitude towards religion in general? Whatever it is. If you ask a very, very general question, such as, what's your attitude towards religion? That very general attitude is not going to predict a specific behavior very well. Okay. As a general rule, general attitudes do not predict specific behaviors. If you want to predict a specific behavior, you want to measure the attitude at the same level of specificity. So if you want to predict if people are going to go to church on Sunday, then you ask them, what is your attitude towards going to church on Sunday? And now you can see that you're measuring at the same level of specificity, right? So that's one condition under which attitudes will predict behaviors. Just to throw out the other ones, I mentioned, so in lecture, I talked about, on one of the slides, I have something called the principle of aggregation. I'm not going to ask you about that on the exam. Okay, I just didn't have time to get into it. It's going to take too long to explain, and it's kind of confusing. So I just skipped over it. So don't worry about the principle of aggregation. The other two conditions under which attitudes and behaviors are linked is if there's a lack of social influence. So what that means is that if you ask people to tell you what their attitudes are in front of a bunch of other people, people will often lie. They won't tell you the truth. Okay. So as a consequence, the answers you get, the attitudes that you get aren't going to predict their behavior because they lied to you about their attitudes. So what you want to do is you ask them questions privately or anonymously, or you hook them up to a fake lie detector test. Remember, I talked about a bogus pipeline. And the reason you want to do that is to get people to be more honest with their attitudes. And if they're honest, then their attitudes will be linked to their behaviors. And the last condition under which attitudes will predict behaviors is if those attitudes are strong. So people who have really, really strong attitudes will tend to behave really consistently with those attitudes. People who have only weak attitudes towards something, you may not behave consistently with your weak attitude. Okay, so strong attitudes predict behaviors better than weak attitudes do. And I can stay a few minutes past 3, by the way, if we need to. I just want to make sure I get through all the questions. Can you repeat what words go with cognitive dissonance, self-presentation? You mean, hang on. Oh, rationalize, justify, yeah, okay. So you mean self-perception, not self-presentation. Those are 2 different things. Self-presentation are the strategies we use to shape what other people think about us. And self-perception is the theory that provides an alternate explanation to cognitive dissonance theory. So the words that go with those, cognitive dissonance theory, you can use words like and you want to use words like rationalize, justify, arouse. You want to get rid of arousal. You're trying to get rid of that negative arousal feeling. That's what you want to put for cognitive dissonance. For self-perception, you don't want to use any of those words. Okay, self-perception theorists do not think there's any negative arousal. They do not think there's any justifying. They do not think there's any rationalizing. For self-perception, you want to use words like people are forming a rational inference or coming to a rational conclusion about what their attitude must be based on thinking about their past behavior. Is that a circumstance where attitudes predict behaviors? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Is what a circumstance? You should also know, for the short answer, I mean, it's a general thing I've mentioned numerous times, is that Kelly's attribution theory is an example of where social psychologists believe that people were behaving rationally, right? And when we looked at other biases like the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer effect, the overjustification effect, those were all examples of attributional biases that show that people don't always behave rationally. So those were discovered in like the late 1970s into the 1980s, right? So there's a contrast between how social psychologists thought that people made attributions early on, which is that they were rational, versus how they realized people actually made attributions later on, which is that they're sometimes irrational. Not telling the truth when asked in front of a crowd of people. Yeah, so if people are not giving you their true attitudes, then their attitudes aren't going to predict their behaviors because they're not giving you their true attitudes, right? So if people aren't telling you the truth, you don't find a relationship between attitudes and behaviors, right? So you need people to be truthful. So attitudes will predict behaviors when people are truthful. How do you make them truthful? Well, one thing you do is you make sure they're not answering the question in front of other people. You make sure they're anonymous so that they're not embarrassed to admit to having negative attitudes or whatever. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So, oh, there we go. Right in the nick of time. How can dissonance be reduced? Well, there are 5 ways that we talked about, right? So you should be familiar with each of these ways, clearly. So we're talking about changing your attitude, changing your behavior, adding a consonant cognition, minimizing the importance of the conflict, and reducing perceived choice. Those are the 5. Those are in the notes. Make sure you understand what each one of those means. Why do we exhibit the fundamental attribution error? So there's a number of reasons why we do this. There's a slide where I gave a list of, I think, 5 reasons maybe. So for instance, it's a lot easier, right, to attribute someone else's behavior to their personality. Why did they behave rudely? Because they're rude. That's a really easy attribution to make, right? And because we don't like to think very much, and because there's only so much we can process at any given time, it's really, really easy to make a dispositional attribution. So that's what we do. We tend to make internal attributions. It's a lot harder to figure out how the situation that person's in might have created that situation or might have led to their behavior. That's a lot harder to do for us. Also because we don't notice the situation. We don't understand how the situation affects people's behavior. So all those reasons are reasons why we engage in the fundamental attribution error. Do we need to know brown nosers? You can be friends with whoever you want. However, what I think you mean is, I think we talked about that when we talked about the problems with self-presentation, right? So we talked about how, although we all engage in self-presentation, if we do it too blatantly or too obviously, people don't like that, right? They come across as being very fake to us, right? And so that's all I mean when I said that, the brown nosing or whatever. We just have like these negative derogatory terms for people who we perceive are engaging in too much self-presentation. Anything else? Over justification effect. Oh, and last page of the study guide. Hang on, let me pull up the study guide too. I don't know if I'll have time to go over everything on there, but let's just pull it up. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, okay, got a bunch of questions here. So let me start with the overjustification effect. So that's an attributional bias. That occurs when you initially really like doing something just for the sake of doing it. You have intrinsic motivation. So let's use an example. Let's say that you, let's say you're a dancer. So you love dancing. You just love to dance, right? And then once we start to get an extrinsic reward, so for instance, you start to get paid to dance, then we start mistakenly thinking that the only reason we're dancing is for that extrinsic reward. So what that means is when you stop to get paid, when the payment goes away, suddenly you don't want to dance anymore because you've mistakenly attributed the reason why you're dancing to the extrinsic reward rather than the intrinsic reason. So it's a mistaken attribution we make about ourselves. We think we're doing it for the money and we don't think we're doing it for the intrinsic motivation anymore. So when people stop to get paid for that behavior, they don't want to do it anymore. Do we have to know the difference between strategic and self-verification and self-presentation? I don't think I asked a question on that for the exam. Just for your knowledge, strategic self-presentation means that we try to get people to think positive things about us. That's basically it. So when I go on a job interview, I want them to think I'm reliable and punctual and hardworking. And I want my friends to think I'm fun and nice and whatever, right? Self-verification means that we want people to think the same thing about ourselves that we think about ourselves. So what that means is that if I have a negative view of myself, if I have some negative view, I have low self-esteem, then according to a self-verification motive, what that means is I want other people to think negative things about me as well. Okay, that way it matches my view of myself. Now, whether that actually exists is kind of debatable, but that's what it means. The first cognitive dissonance experiment. So that's the one I talked about already. That's the one where people were paid either $1 or $20 to lie to someone else to tell them how much fun the study was. So I'm not going to go over the whole thing again because I talked about that a few minutes ago. But the basic idea is that the people who were only paid $1 to tell a lie came to convince themselves they really liked the study as a way of justifying why they lied to the person. The last three. Is that the 4 components that are necessary for cognitive dissonance? So I've talked about that one already. So when I post this on YouTube, which I'll do right after this, you can always go back and watch it, but I've talked about those 4 components already. How does self-perception theory explain the results of dissonance experiments? And what are the basic differences? So I also basically explained this one as well. So when I explain this also in terms of that original cognitive dissonance study, okay? So So basically the idea is that the people who are paid $1 to lie to someone else, tell them how much fun the study was, according to a cognitive dissonance explanation, they did that to justify why they told that person how much fun the study was. They had to justify that, which they did by convincing themselves they really liked the study. That way it makes sense why I told them how much fun the study was. And a self-perception theorist says that what happens is that when these participants are asked at the very end, what is your attitude? Did you like being in the study? They think back, they don't justify anything, but rather they think back and they say, well, 5 minutes ago, I told someone else how much fun the study was. I only did it for $1, so I didn't obviously do it for the money. So I guess I told them because I must have really liked it. So I guess I must really like the study. And under what circumstances is each of these applicable? I talked about that as well. So basically when the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is large, that's when cognitive dissonance theory kicks in. When the discrepancy between the behavior and the attitude is small, that's when self-perception theory kicks in. And I know I talk really fast a lot of the time, but definitely I'll post it on YouTube and you can go back and rewatch it. What are the 3 components of attitudes and how are they measured? I assume by components, you're talking about the affective, behavioral, and cognitive components. So affective, how we feel about something, behavioral, how we behave towards that object, and cognitive, the beliefs we have about why we have that attitude. How are they measured? Oh, how are attitudes measured? So attitudes are measured mostly through self-report. Most of the time, we just ask people, what is your attitude towards whatever? But people have tried a couple of other mechanisms as well. There's certain physiological mechanisms, but I'm not going to ask you any questions about that, so you don't have to know those. And people have also tried some ways of measuring implicit attitudes by using implicit measures, such as the implicit association test. But we haven't gone over that yet, so I'm not going to ask you a question on that either. Anything else? Okay, I don't see anything else. So in that case, good luck to you guys. I will post this, as I said, I'll post this on YouTube in the next 10 to 15 minutes, and I will send out an email to everybody. So you can always go over anything I've said. Sound good? All right, guys. Well, have a good rest of your Sunday, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye, guys.